In this lesson, I want to build a super simple C# application. I want you to follow along. It's a hello world application, meaning that we're merely going to print out the words hello world to a console window. And the point of this exercise is just to show you the basic workflow. So I'm not going to attempt to even explain why we're doing what we're doing. The focus will be on what I'm going to do next and how I'm doing it. In other words, I want you to focus on the basic workflow. That'll be the same for all the applications we'll build in this course and pretty much every application you'll ever build using C#. Things like how to create a new project. Where do you type in your C# code? How do you test your application to make sure that it's running correctly? And what do you do whenever you have an error in your code? How do you save your project? Things of that nature. So for now, just try to follow along. Don't worry if something doesn't make a lot of sense at this point. That's really what the rest of this course is for. In the next few lessons after this one, we're going to dissect this tiny little application that we built. And I'm going to explain at that point why we did what we did. And then what does the code mean and why it's doing what it's doing. And just a quick reminder, like I said in the previous video, the introduction of this course, I'm going to assume that you have some version and some edition of Visual Studio already installed. Even if your Visual Studio looks a little bit different than mine does on camera here, don't be overly concerned about that. The basics are the same no matter what, I promise. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started here. And to begin, we're going to create a new project. There are a number of different ways to do this, but I'm going to keep it simple and go to File, New, Project, and selecting that menu option will open up the New Project dialog. Now, chances are the number of items that you see here in this center part will be dramatically different than the items that I see based on which version and edition of Visual Studio that you have installed. However, you should be able to select templates and then select C#, and one of the options should be a console application. Alright, so I want you to select that, and then we're going to rename this project to Hello World. Now notice I used a little naming convention where I use a capital H in Hello and a capital W in World, and I don't use a space in between the two words. Now that's just a naming convention that I came up with to help me identify projects a little bit easier, something I recommend that you follow. We shouldn't have to make any other changes in this dialog. I'm going to go ahead and click the OK button. And Visual Studio will go off and now create the starting point of a console window application for us. Alright, and so now you should see in this main area, in this text area, a file open called program.cs. And there's some code here that is already generated for us, boilerplate code. We're going to ignore most of that, except we're going to find this innermost set of curly braces. Now, one of the first things you're going to need to do when you're learning how to develop software is tell the difference between parentheses, curly braces, square brackets, angle brackets, and I don't know that I left out any, okay? But here we want the curly braces, look like little mustaches turned on their side. These are important. And I want to go inside of those two, that opening and closing curly brace, and make some room for ourselves. This is where we're going to type our code. So it's approximately line 13 and 14, at least in my copy of Visual Studio. And then I'm going to type in the following. I type in console, and you may notice now this little window pops up below what I'm typing. You can safely ignore that for now. Eventually this becomes our best friend, but for now it might kind of be distracting and get in the way. Just try to ignore it and type in everything by hand to the best of your ability. Console, and then I want to use the period on the keyboard. I'm going to call it the dot. So console dot, and then capital W, right, capital L, line. Next, I'm going to use an opening and closing parenthesis. So that's not a curly brace. These are just the like the characters you would use for a smiley face in an emoticon. Okay, and then inside of there, I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to kind of navigate around here. I'm going to go inside of the opening and closing parenthesis, and I'm going to use two double quotes. So it should look like that. All right. Make sure you don't use single quotation marks like that. That's not what we want. We want double quotation marks like that. Okay? And inside of there, we're going to type in the words hello, and world. All right? So make sure that you have an open parenthesis, a double quote, the words hello world, then another double quote, then another parenthesis, a closing parenthesis, and then at the very end of this line I'm going to use a semicolon, and it looks like that. All right, so it's not a colon and it's not a comma. All right, it looks like that. All right, and then I'm going to use the enter key on my keyboard to go to the next line. I'm going to type in console dot capital read capital L in line opening and closing parenthesis. Now you may have noticed that as you type in the opening parenthesis, that Visual Studio will automatically type in a closing word for you. Don't let that throw you. You can continue just to type through that, but make sure that you have exactly what I've typed into my code window here for these 2 lines of code. Make sure that the capitalization is correct. Make sure that you're using a period, not a comma, for the little mark that comes after the word console. Make sure you're using parentheses and not some other type of bracket or brace, and then make sure that both lines of code end with a semicolon. All right. So the next thing that I want to do is save my project. So I'm going to go, and there are a number of different ways to do this in Visual Studio. Again, I'm going to keep it simple and go to File, Save All. All right. And then the next thing I want to do is now see my application actually running. And so to do that, I can either find this little green arrow, this little green triangle that has the word start next to it, or if I don't see that, by default in my little toolbar here at the top, I can go to Debug and select Start Debugging. Either way should work. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And you'll notice that some windows pop up and Visual Studio changes its appearance a little bit. Now off to the side of my screen, the console window popped up and we see the words Hello World with a blinking cursor below it. I'm just going to hit the enter key on my keyboard, and then the console window disappears and I'm back into Visual Studio, kind of resets itself, and we're successful, right? However, maybe your experience wasn't successful. Maybe you saw an error message. So what I want to do is take a moment and look at some common errors that people that are new to C# might run into and how to remedy them. And this is a good opportunity to learn some of the syntax rules of C# as we make mistakes. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video, make a mistake, and then we'll talk about it, pause it, and so on. Alright, so when you attempted to start the application, you may have seen a little dialog pop up from Visual Studio that says there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? Always select no for that, okay? And what you'll see next is a list of errors. Now, in some cases, the error messages will be obvious to you and they'll make a lot of sense. Sometimes they won't. Like the verbiage might be something we're just not familiar with yet. Invalid token in class struct or interface. What does that mean? Okay. So typically what you can just do is double click on these and it'll put your mouse cursor on the line where the problem is. Notice that Visual Studio also gives you another visual way to tell that there's a problem with your code. It gives you this little red squiggly line. Sometimes you'll see a blue squiggly line. They're a little bit different, but essentially this is an area of the code that probably deserves your attention, something you need to fix. Now in this particular case, the problem is that we didn't type our code in between the innermost opening and closing curly braces. And so this is an issue with regards to defining a code block in C# or a block of code. So different C# commands belong in different kinds of code blocks. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in this course talking about the different types of code blocks and what belongs in each type of code block. But to remedy this issue, what you need to do, use your mouse and just kind of drag and highlight these 2 lines, or you can use the Shift key on your keyboard and the arrow keys to kind of highlight that area, hit Control X, then move up in between the opening and closing curly brace and paste Control V, that code in there, and then it should run correctly at that point. All right. So that teaches us the first thing about C#. It matters where we type our code. All right. Or when you try to run the application, you may have seen the same build error dialog, except you see the message semicolon expected. Hopefully this is an obvious remedy for you. If you double click on that error in the error list, it should take you to the end of the line of code where you forgot to add a semicolon. And so that's the second thing about C# that we're going to learn, is that just like a properly formed English sentence has to end with a period or a question mark or an exclamation mark, a properly formed instruction in C# has to end with a semicolon. All right? Or maybe the error that you saw was something like a syntax error, something expected, the name hello doesn't exist in the current context, the name world doesn't exist in the current context. If you were to double click these, you'll get to the vicinity of the problem, and you'll also see that there's red squiggly lines beneath the words hello and world in between of our parentheses. Now remember, we needed to use double quotation marks around that string of characters hello world. And so alphanumeric characters that we want to literally write to screen or present in some way, we need to surround them with characters that indicate that we want to use this literal string, the string of literal characters. Okay, so to do that we use double quotes. Or perhaps you see the error, something like the name console does not exist in the current context. And you're like, it doesn't exist in the current context. And you look at the word and you say, well, it looks spelled correctly. Remember that I told you you had to type exactly what I was typing. And so C# is case sensitive, meaning that a lowercase c and an uppercase C mean that you're typing two completely different things into C#. Okay, and that is tricky because many of us are not used to that degree of precision whenever we're communicating. But when communicating with a computer, you have to be precise. So in this case, all we needed to do was change the capitalization of the word console, and we're back in business. Or perhaps you see something like console does not contain a definition for either Readline or Readline, and again you're looking at it and you're thinking it's spelled correctly. Well, what could the problem be? Here again, capitalization is important. Lowercase r Readline is different than uppercase r Readline, and lowercase l Readline is different than uppercase L Readline. Okay, and so again, things have to be spelled correctly and have the correct capitalization in order to be processed correctly by the C# compiler. We'll talk about compilation in the next lesson. Now fortunately, if you're not good at spelling and you're not good at typing and capitalization and you're just not as precise in the way that you would type a letter or an email message or even a text message, fortunately Visual Studio can help you out. There are tools that will help you not only write your code more quickly but also more accurately, and chances are if you utilize those tools, the chances that you will miss some of these really simple syntax things like capitalization will almost be completely eliminated. We'll talk about some of those tools in an upcoming lesson. All right, but assuming that you got all of this to work correctly, you're really well on your way to building applications. You've already crossed over one of the big first steps, and as you undoubtedly learned in this lesson, writing C# code is an exercise in being precise, in precision. And again, fortunately, the Visual Studio IDE will help you out a lot when it comes to that. It will give you clues, and maybe some of the phrases and the words that they use to explain the issue might not be familiar to you yet. With experience it will be, but generally it'll point you into the right direction, and with the red squiggly lines in the message you can typically figure out what the issue is. Now throughout this course, if you run into a wall and you simply can't figure out what the problem is, do this. Compare character by character. Take your time until you kind of develop a vision for the problems where your eye will jump to the problem in code. Compare what you wrote versus what I wrote. I'll supply the source code to you, and so open it up in a second, copy of Visual Studio and then just look character by character. What did I do different than what Bob did? All right, and that will usually help you figure things out if you can't do it on your own. All right, so in the following lessons, we're going to focus on two things. First of all, we're going to talk about why we did what we did and what was going on behind the scenes that turned our code into a working application, albeit a small application. What happens whenever we create a new project? What happens whenever we choose to save our project? What happens whenever we choose to start or run our application? And then secondly, we're going to talk about the syntax of the C# code that we wrote, and we'll learn more syntax rules and more keywords as we go along. So if precision is so very important in C#, then you're going to need to have some explanation as to what all those little words and symbols actually mean and some rules to guide you as you're writing your own code. It's really easy once you get a few of the basics under your belt. Being completely honest, many people learn how to code, how to write code, and C# is a fairly easy language to learn. You can do this. Just you got to put in a little bit of time, a little bit of effort to figure it out. All right? So we'll begin that process in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. Now in this lesson we want to start the process of dissecting that little application that we wrote in the previous lesson. Now previously I wanted you to focus on the workflow, what we did and how we did it. But now what I want to do is focus on why we did what we did. It's really crucial at this point that we cement some really important ideas in your mind because they're going to provide the basis, the foundation for everything that comes next. So what I want to do is start on the inside and kind of work our way out. And I'll start by talking about the nature of writing code. When you learn how to write applications with C#, really any programming language, learning the syntax of C#, or in other words, learning the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language is really just half the battle. The other half of the battle is learning about related pre-built functionality that's available to the code that you write. Now in our case, Microsoft has created something called the .NET Framework, which sounds kind of spooky and mysterious, but it's really not that bad. It's actually pretty large, but we're only going to focus on two specific portions of it for our purposes. The first part that I want to focus on is something called the class library, which is simply just a library of code that Microsoft wrote to take care of difficult tasks so that we as software developers, we don't have to worry about them. So there's library code to help with many common sorts of things that many applications will need. Things like working with math or working with strings and text and working with dates, manipulating dates and times, maybe displaying things to the computer screen or transmitting information across a network. So a lot of that kind of foundational stuff that would be difficult for us to write and is utilized by many different applications. So that's really the first part. It's taking advantage and understanding the class library of the .NET Framework. The second part of the .NET Framework is called the runtime. It's also known as the Common Language Runtime. You'll see it called as the CLR as well. And really it's just this protective bubble that wraps around your application. Your application lives inside of it. It runs inside of that protective bubble. And it essentially takes care of a lot of the low-level details so that you, the software developer, you can focus on what your application is supposed to do, not worry so much about how it's actually accomplishing it under the hood. You don't have to worry about the computer's operating system interacting with it and interacting with memory and interacting with, the hardware, the computer itself. Many of those things are kind of abstracted away from you. You don't have to worry about them. Furthermore, the CLR, that runtime, also provides a layer of protection for the end user. so that you, the malicious, evil software developer, you can't do something really bad to somebody's computer without them at least giving you permission to do it in the first place. So without their knowledge and their approval, you're not going to be able to wipe out their entire hard drive, for example. For right now, it's the .NET Framework class library that I really want to focus on because it's what we used, whether you realize it or not, whenever we were writing our first application. So, for example, in lines 13 and 14, where we did our work, you see console.writeLine, and then we used open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and so on. We were using code in the framework class library that knows how to display text into a console window. All we got to do is say, hey, use this text, stick it in a window. And we don't really care how it does its job. We just care that it did it. Okay. And so the next line of code, this console.readline, it was also really important. We're telling the application to wait for input from the end user before continuing its execution. So again, here we're calling code in the .NET Framework class library that knows how to accept user input. You recall that I used the enter key on the keyboard, and then the application continued on, it exited, and we were back into Visual Studio. So in both of those lines of code, we were utilizing methods that were defined, that were created by somebody at Microsoft to handle that interaction with displaying and retrieving data from the end user. So what were to happen if we were to comment out that line of code? And here, to comment out a line of code, I use 2 forward slashes on my computer. It's over the question mark. And commenting out code simply means that I want those instructions to be ignored. Now, I could have just deleted that line of code completely, but I might want it later. So maybe I don't want to remove it completely. I just want to ignore it for now. Okay. I also might use code comments to write myself some notes to remind myself of something about the application in the future. We'll talk about code comments a little bit later. But if we were to run the application now, watch what happens. Okay, it ran and it's already done. What happened? Well, you might have seen a flicker on screen for like a fraction of a second. The reason was because, hey, it executed this one line of code and it said, well, looks like I'm done here, and it exits out of the application. By adding the read line, we're now stopping execution, waiting for the end user to do something before exiting out. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so next let's talk about the position of the code that we wrote. I made sure to emphasize that you have to write the code in the correct place, and the correct place was in between the opening and closing curly braces of that innermost set of curly braces, as defined kind of by the level of indentation that we saw in the boilerplate code. So if you don't add the code there, we saw what the ramification of that was, right? The application, you'll try to run it, it'll give you a runtime error. The correct place for that code was where we have it right now, in between that opening and closing curly brace that you see on screen. Now, as you can see, there's several sets of curly braces, and so it's important that we talk about what these do. And I need to oversimplify things here. We will come back and fill in some of the details later. But essentially, you have an opening and closing set of curly braces, and those define a code block. And code blocks typically have names, and they have purposes. So in this particular case, we have a first code block, and this code block has the name main. Okay, and this particular code block is known as a method, and this particular method, by convention, is the very first method that's called whenever your application is executed. All right, and so I don't want you to worry about these other words, static and void, and even the string and the args for right now. We'll talk about those later on. But this entire code block here, as well as the line above it, they define something called a method. And a method is simply a block of code that has a name. Now later on, you're going to come to realize that a method is so much more than that, but I want to use that as a working definition as we're getting started here. The method has a name, and when you have a name, you can call a name and say, I want you to execute. All right. And so we'll talk about methods again a little bit more in a little while. This main method lives inside of another set of curly braces, and that set of curly braces also have a name. The name is program. It's a class called program. And so you can think of a class as simply a container for all of the methods of your application. You can kind of keep the methods that are related to each other in separate classes. Now, what do I mean by related to each other? Well, that's really for you, the developer, to decide. As you get deeper into programming, you're going to come to understand the thought process behind organizing your code. But that's a little ways off for now. Just trust me on that. Now, I said that a class was merely a way to organize your methods. It is so much more than that. And again, I'm way oversimplifying this as we're getting started here. But the main takeaway for right now is that that code is organized in curly brace containers, and you have some blocks of code that reside inside of other blocks of code. And to kind of emphasize that again, here we have another set of curly braces, and this set of curly braces has a name as well. In fact, it's a namespace called Hello World, which happens to be the name of the application that we gave it. Again, keep things extremely simple here. A namespace is just another way of organizing code. Again, at some point it becomes so much more than that, but let's keep it simple for now. So let's take a look at these lines of code and kind of illustrate these ideas about namespaces that contain classes that contain methods. Here what we're doing whenever we're calling console.WriteLine is we're actually making a call into the .NET Framework class library. Remember, it's that library of code supplied by Microsoft, and we're saying in that entire library there's a book, and there's a chapter inside of that book that I want to reference. All right. So in this case, we're saying that book is the console book, the class, and I want you to look at the chapter named WriteLine that has the definition for this method. All right. Hopefully that analogy works for you. But we're looking inside of a library to find a class, and we're going to call a particular method inside of that class. And by using its name, we can execute all the code that was written inside of that method. Same with the method that we're calling below it as well. Notice that there is a period that we use between the name of the class and the method name, and we use that. It's called a member accessor. It allows us to access a member of the class, or in other words, now that we know what the book is, we can find out what chapter we want to reference. Okay, hopefully that analogy works for you. Now notice also that whenever we call the WriteLine method and the Readline method, that they both have parentheses following them. Now, in the case of the WriteLine method, we're actually sticking something in between the opening and closing parentheses, whereas in the Readline method, we're not. But essentially, those parentheses are saying not only do we want to reference that particular class method name, but the parentheses mean I want you to actually invoke it, execute it, do it now. Okay, so that's the purpose for those parentheses. Now, we can say do it now and pass in information. Do it now with this stuff, with this argument. So we're passing in an argument to the WriteLine method and saying, we want you to do it, write this to screen, and here's what we want you to write. So it's an input parameter to the method named WriteLine. Okay. Now don't worry, we're going to come back to the notion of methods in the future, as well as passing values into a method like we did as we passed in the literal string hello world into our method here. Just know that whenever you see parentheses after a given word in your code, you should be thinking that that code is being called right now as we step through the execution of the code. Next up, let's talk about the semicolon. We've already kind of explained it in the previous video, but just to kind of emphasize it, notice that almost everything, even these statements at the very top, have semicolons, with the exception of whenever we're defining a namespace, a class, or a method. And we said at the time that the semicolons are actually similar to the period or exclamation mark or question mark at the end of an English sentence. It completes a thought in C#. Now, some programming languages, like Visual Basic, for example, they don't really have this idea. They only allow one complete thought per line of code. However, with C#, you could do this, what I'm about to do. Watch. Okay, now I have both of those lines of code on a single line. All right, and if we run the application, it'll work just as it did before. All right, so the way that you separate or indicate that you have two different complete thoughts is through the use of a semicolon. Furthermore, we could put lines of code on separate lines like this. Now, it wouldn't make sense in this case because the line of code is so short. It actually makes it difficult to read, but sometimes when you have a very, 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 very long line of code, you'll see me split that line of code into multiple lines, and still the application will execute. Now, in other programming languages, you wouldn't have that behavior, all right? Because really, white space and line feeds and things of that nature, they don't matter to C#. The only thing that really matters is to indicate a complete thought is a semicolon at the end of the line. Let me go ahead and get rid of all that. And the other thing that I want to mention here that you may have noticed is the level of indentation that you get automatically from Visual Studio. Now, that's completely optional, and Visual Studio nudges you in the right direction, but essentially, even if you were to kind of come out here, and we'll use the tab key several times and write the word console.writeline, something like that, and notice that Visual Studio re-indented it for us. Why do you suppose it did that? Well, many people believe that indentation helps the readability of the code so that you can see what code container, where code resides inside of the other curly braces inside of your application. All right. And so kind of along those same lines, for readability's sake, notice that there are many different colors that are used as text inside of this text editor window. You have these royal blue colors, and these are my default colors. Yours might look a little bit different, but by default, I think you have some royal blue, some black. You have aqua color here. This is a dark red. You have some light gray and light blue. All right, and all of those are used to help you identify the parts of speech, I guess you can say, inside of the code that you write. All right, we'll talk more about that as we talk more about the syntax of C# in an upcoming lesson. Okay. All right, so now that we've talked about the code that we wrote and its position and formatting and white space and tabs and all that sort of stuff, what I want to do is stop right now for this video, and in the next one I want to talk about the files themselves, the file that we typed our code into, how that relates to projects and even solutions, what happened when we saved our project, what happened when we actually ran our project, and so we'll do that in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.